Nice, nice. Okay, how many of you enjoyed a potato? All right, lots of potatoes. Wonderful. Let's give the kitchen crew a round of applause for the kitchen crew. Woo-hoo! They're too busy cleaning up. Well, welcome. We're glad you're here. So glad Dr. Pelech could make it, and his wife, beautiful wife, come with him. We had a great session with the young adults from 4 to 6 p.m. Lots of good questions, a lot of dialogue. So just to kick things off, we do have a Green Gourmet Supper Club, whole food, plant-based, Tuesday night. If you're interested, see Lori. And you have to register, and there's her email on the screen. She also teaches classes on hydrotherapy and natural remedies, so talk to her there. Check back with White Rock Live, WRWC. We've done Pecha Kucha in the past, and we bring in speakers from time to time. Dr. Pelech is one of them, so keep checking back. In the back, there are materials on world views that might help. And check with Covadas TV, who's filming, because they are going to be posting this after they finish editing it.
And the sign-up sheet at the back.
Oh, okay. And if you want to be on our alert sign-up sheet with Renee, this is Renee. Say hello, Renee. Yes, that's Renee. Contact her, sign up, and then you'll get our emails. We have Paul's advertising our Serpentine Prophecy, October 21 and 22. And yes, so here's Dr. Pelech. We did this last time as a honor and a salute, and then we have a slight prayer. I think it's important to recognize how people have suffered. So please cooperate with me as I go through these slides. Please stand if you personally have had COVID. Okay. We honor you. Thank you. Be seated. Please stand if someone you know has had COVID. Everybody. Yes. Okay. There you go. Please be seated. Now please stand if you know of someone who died from COVID. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. None in the balcony. Okay, we honor you too. Please stand if you suffer personally from long COVID. 1, 2. 2 people. Keep fighting. Please stand if you know someone suffering from long COVID. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Lots of people. Lots of people. Thank you. Please stand if you have had an adverse vaccine reaction. Milo. God bless you. Please stand if you know someone who has had an adverse vaccine reaction. Lots of people. Lots of people. Thank you. Please stand if you know someone who died of a vaccine treatment. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 people. Thank you. Please stand if you have lost your job because of your conscience. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. We honor you. Please be seated. Please also stand if you know someone who has lost their job because of their conscience. Lots of people. Lots of people. By far the majority. Please be seated. Please bow your heads. We're going to have a prayer for those who suffer. God of the suffering, we ask that you would be with all those that suffer. You wept while on earth, and please weep with those who suffer. Give strength, courage, they may continue the fight toward health, truth, and freedom. We ask in the name of Jesus. Amen. Amen. So, Dr. Pelech, how do we know which expert to trust?
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, scientists in general, we're looking for the truth. And when we have something that we believe is actually right, we're going to publish it in a scientific journal, usually. And they do undergo peer review by other experts in the field. And so once it's part of the scientific literature, we look at that information from the standpoint that there's some truth there. We are trained to be critical thinkers, to look at the methodology, to make sure that the conclusions based on the results using that methodology warrants those conclusions. And we don't go on just one scientific paper, we go on a body of research that builds over time. As time has transpired with the COVID-19 pandemic, we have a huge body of scientific literature now. And the problem is you have to consider the credibility of the individual in terms of, do they have the scientific background and experience and are knowledgeable in the area that we're talking about. And you also, unfortunately, have to consider conflict of interest. Is there some reasons why that individual may in fact be pushing that narrative because there may be some reasons why they do that? And unfortunately, conflict of interest doesn't just apply to financial interest, but in terms of getting along with your colleagues, being able to publish in scientific journals. There's a variety of other things that are not just direct financial, but can influence and bias an individual. Mm-hmm. So it's very important as a scientist or anyone that we're open-minded, that we consider the possibilities, but at the same time you have to exercise some sort of critical thinking and judgment. And there is within us, I think, a certain amount of gut feel from your lifetime of experience that can help guide you into whether this doesn't seem right, something smells fishy. And I think there's such an overwhelming amount of data now that, especially when the narrative keeps changing, that, first you hear these vaccines are highly safe, and then you hear that they're going to prevent you from getting COVID, and then you hear, well, you're still going to get COVID and you can still transmit COVID, because originally we were taking those so we wouldn't infect grandma and grandpa. And then you hear that, well, you can still give COVID to somebody else, but for yourself, well, but you're not going to get that sick from COVID now. And so the story changes over time so that it's become less and less compelling. And I think what you'll see from this evening, it's actually even less compelling than you think to actually get vaccinated. Yeah.
Okay. The Hebrew Bible says, "Come now, let us reason together." Good public policy, I've heard, requires good public debate. Has UBC had good public debate?
No. I tried to do this as a senator at UBC to raise the question of the masking, of the vaccination policy. Fortunately, UBC, we did not introduce mandatory vaccination unless you were involved in social clubs or athletics, or you worked on a hospital site. But apart from that, we were very fortunate. It was unlike Ontario, for example, where all of the university students had to get vaccinated. So we're fortunate in that sense, but the public debate that's actually happening amongst the experts is in the courts of the country. There are many court cases. Brian Peckford's one is the most notable, for where there's a challenge to the Human Rights Code. But the experts that are advocating, from the public health agencies, the policies, they brought in university professors to argue for, and then there's been a lot of other people like myself that are expert witnesses that are in the courts, and the debate is happening in the courts, unlike where it should, as you point out, should be actually in the academic institutions. It's starting to happen, but it's way too late. Too much damage has already been done. But the courts, it's going to be up to the judges to make the decisions based on the evidence. Unfortunately, to date, it's been pretty poor because the judges are like everybody else. They read the same newspapers, highly censored. They get the same message from the public health authorities, which they have faith in, that they believe that these people know what they're doing. And so it's hard for them to wrap their minds around that, but it's starting to happen. And courts in other countries are now overruling these policies. So it is going to be fought out in the courts, and it will be won in the courts. Then eventually science will prevail, and we'll know really what's going on.
Thank you. I'm going to put some quotes on the screen, and from a scientific perspective, I'd like you to analyze them. Stay at home, stay out of hospital, no freedom for you, isolation for you, wear a badge entitled unjabbed, no jab, no life, no pub, club, gym, restaurant, travel, work, no unvaxxed on the street. We've tried the carrot, now we're going to do the stick. Fines may cut through your ignorance. You are a killer. No supermarket, no ball game, no shirt, no shoes, no vaccine, no service. You're an idiot. Vaccination is your route to liberty. You are an enemy. You are a moron, snowflake, coward, loser. You don't believe in science. You might be a misogynist. You could be a racist. You take up space. Shall we tolerate these people? Don't think you can get on a plane, a train beside vaccinated people and put them at risk. A pandemic of the unvaccinated, we cannot have the unvaxxed roaming around the place spreading the virus. Our strategy is to off the unvaccinated by making daily life more difficult. They do not deserve ICU beds and should be left to die.
Yeah, that's just some of it. And of course, Trudeau, has had COVID twice this year, after probably being vaccinated, I would imagine 4 times. So it's obviously not working for him. But yeah, you can look at the Toronto Star and what was on the cover and just replace every word that was said about, with Jew. And you're seeing basically back in Nazi Germany. And so many of the things that are said here have been said about other, ethnic groups and the like, and we're seeing just a new form of discrimination by people that are actually pretty woke, which is kind of interesting. Yeah.
From a scientific perspective.
There's no science for that. Basically, Anthony Fauci, the head of the National Institutes of Health for Infectious Diseases, will tell you that if you get COVID-19, whether you're unvaccinated or vaccinated, you are just as transmissible of COVID-19. There's no difference. And in many countries, it's now recognized that, in fact, the National Institutes of Health now, the guidelines and the CDC, that just came out in, I guess, the beginning of around beginning of September, is that there should be no difference in treatments of anyone who's vaccinated versus anyone who's unvaccinated. So that's coming from the scientists that should know better, and they're starting to eventually wisen up.
So in this atmosphere, how do we have a respectful conversation?
Oh, so many people have been injured by the vaccines and have suffered from COVID-19 too. And we have to understand that there's such fear and paranoia that exists. I mean, we've all seen people, even by themselves, on a dike, walking, or in a car, wearing masks. You wonder what's happening in the home. They're so gripped by fear. And while they may have mistreated those of us that have decided not to become vaccinated, because we have our concerns about the vaccine itself, you have to basically have an understanding for these people and understand where they're coming from and not be angry. You have to try to be there for when they're ready to make that mental leap to recognizing that they've been screwed, and that some of it may be permanent. The good news is that
You saw the people that lost their jobs here.
Yes, I know, and that's going to have to heal with time, and hopefully they can get their jobs back if they want to. But I think it's been a kind of an awakening for many people to realize just how dispensable we actually are. Despite all the training that you have, despite all the experience that you have from decades of being at that job, and so much to offer, to recognize that you actually aren't that important in the big scheme of things. That's something you have to wrap around in your own mind too. And we would hope that there's justice. This is why we're going to the courts, to try to see that unemployment insurance was not available basically to unvaccinated people that were fired from their jobs because they refused to be vaccinated. These kind of injustices do have to be dealt with, and we are working hard to try to have that happen in the courts. But the first thing we have to do is get the truth out there so that people know exactly what's going on. And then we can try to heal from there.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're going to switch the computers over. There's a number over here that's the same as that number over there. If you have a question and want to address it to Dr. Pelech, text that number. And we're going to switch the computers, and if you give your presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I gave a session earlier. So what I'm going to do is recap that session very briefly, without slides, and first introduce myself. So why should you listen to me? So I've been involved in. I have a PhD in biochemistry. I've worked in an immunology institute as a senior scientist for 7 years. I've been a faculty member and research scientist at UBC for about 34 years. I've trained with Nobel Prize winners in the United States, as well as people that are well known in Europe. I've founded 2 biotech companies. The first one was actually looking for drugs to treat cancer and diabetes. I was the president and CEO of that company for 6 years, and then I started with my wife, Catherine Sutter, here, who's with me, Connexus Bioinformatics, where we've run this company for 22 years. We've done work for over 2,000 labs, including all the top pharma companies in the world, the top 30. But we've done for 2,000 labs in universities and industry and hospitals. We, as a company, have provided technology to identify basically biomarkers of diseases, of cancer and neurological disorders. But the technology that we have allows us to take any gene sequence and make artificially portions of that protein that we can put into rabbits, immunize them, to which they make antibodies, And then we've made about 1,600 antibodies in rabbits that are used in cancer research and neurological research. So we're very familiar with immunology and the techniques in making antibodies and testing antibodies. And so when the sequence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus first became available, we were able to synthesize in pieces, 6,000 pieces, the 28 proteins of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and then look to see which of those pieces do people make antibodies against. And so we developed tests that since, I guess we've been testing since December of 2019. We have people who were sick at those times. We got their blood samples and we could confirm that they actually had antibodies against SARS-CoV-2 virus this way. And with that test, I mean, many of you have indicated you have COVID, but I can assure you, you all pretty much have antibodies against SARS-CoV-2, and you have all been infected with the virus. Many of you have been vaccinated as well. So the virus has been around for almost 3 years coming up, because in the study that we've done, 4,000 people we've tested, and of those 4,000 people, about 1,550 had symptoms of COVID-19. 250 of them were able to get the tests that they, by PCR tests, had it. The problem is, 3/4 of the people that were in our study for the last 2.8 years, 3/4 of them got COVID in December of 2019, January, February, and March of 2020. The first wave of COVID-19 was the biggest wave, and we didn't even realize it. And contrary to the narrative from public health, this virus didn't just show up in mid-March. I mean, you don't have to be real critical thinkers about this, right? I mean, you have a virus that comes from China, that this was going around even in November in China, and the first place that's going to come from the Orient to basically North America, it's going to be the Vancouver area, right? Because we have a very large Chinese population, very mobile, very successful business people going back and forth, and this happened during the holiday time, which includes Chinese New Year's, and so it was inevitable. And the very first case of COVID-19 reported in North America was just south of the border in I guess, a nursing home in Washington State. So to think that somehow magically this virus skipped the lower mainland and then went through China into Italy and Europe and then spread across Canada and then ended up in Vancouver in mid-March, I mean, that's just makes no sense at all. And so the data that we have actually does show that most of the people in our study were first infected with the virus during those first 4 months. Okay? So the other reason why you can listen to me is because I'm actually part of the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. This is a network of scientists and lawyers and other people that are really been following the COVID-19 pandemic situation as critical thinkers. So I've listed a few of the people that are in our group here that are willing to come forward and be identified. We actually have about 17 committees, different committees in the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. We have 1,700 members. Over 600 of them are medical doctors and scientists, researchers. I am a co-director, co-chair with Dr. Chris Shaw, who's also at the University of British Columbia, of the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee of the Alliance. So our committee has 38 members. We meet weekly by Zoom. We communicate daily by emails. We're reviewing all the scientific literature that's coming out, the public health data, the information coming from the companies producing these products, and we vet them, and we subject with our expertise critical analysis. And so what I'm going to tell you today has been vetted through this committee, and we all share basically the same conclusions. So you're not just actually seeing just me, you're actually seeing a reflection of what this group of eminent scientists, which include people that have awards for immunology, some of the top, virologists and immunologists in the country. Okay. Okay. Thank you. Now, so that's why you should listen to me. So I don't know if you can see this from the back, but the key point here is to understand when we look at the latest numbers. I took this on like August the 20th, so numbers have changed a little bit, but not too much. But the key point here is this is a breakdown in each row of the ages. Now, by the way, all these slides, I'm going to put it in a PDF format, and I'm going to send them to Basic Don Anderson so that he can make sure that you, if you want, you might be able to get them from him. Okay, so everything that's here is available, and it has all the references so you can go right to the primary sources. Something that I would have liked to have seen in Bonnie Henry's latest order, which makes all these statements with absolutely no references. Everything I'm making, I have my references here. Okay, now the key point here is when you look at the first three lines here is 0 to 11-year-olds, 12 to 19, and then 20 to 29, and it just goes on to 80-year-olds and plus. And so when you look at the number of deaths that have occurred in the country during the entire pandemic, there's 37 that are under 11, there's another 22 under 19, and 142 under 29 years of age. That's during the entire pandemic. That represents, in terms of the total numbers of deaths collectively, about 0.04% of all the deaths from COVID-19 in Canada. The bulk of the deaths are actually occurring here, of course, in the 70 to 79-year-olds and the 80-year-olds. They account for about 16% of the total deaths. Okay?
Is that with COVID?
This is with COVID, not from COVID. So if you take the numbers that have been determined from Ontario Public Health, they try to do an estimate, well, how many people that were hospitalized that died was from COVID, as opposed to coming to the hospital for another reason, and then finding out that they had COVID at the hospital. So they calculated 46%. So roughly half of the numbers here of deaths, you can divide that in half. That was actually from COVID, okay? So these are large numbers. Collectively, the case numbers officially is 3.6 million. Of course, that's really a tenth of the population of the country. So in reality, you all have had COVID. So you can take those numbers and divide by 10 again in terms of your likelihood to die from COVID. Okay. So, the latest data that was still available from public health here in British Columbia, we had heard that this was a pandemic of the unvaccinated. So, well, what actually happened? So this is looking at the period from April to May. We don't get this data anymore from public health. It's too embarrassing, I guess. So here's the total number of cases. So just so you understand from the back, we're looking at about 14% of all cases are unvaccinated. All the rest are triple or double vaccinated here, okay? So when you look at the case numbers, so this is 5.3 million in our province, right? So basically, I think right now it's probably about 87% of the population has been double vaccinated. So when you look here, well, this is the case numbers. So you see that the number of cases is 14%. But it's 14% of the total number in the province. So there's no increase in case numbers here with unvaccinated, it's the same. And 15% for hospitalizations, okay. Critical care, a little bit higher, but not that much higher. And there's a number of reasons why this may be the case, and I can explain them. But deaths, well, 14% is unvaccinated, but they account for 9% of the deaths. Okay, this is BC Centre for Disease Control data. I didn't make this up. So 73% of all the deaths are in the triple vaccinated. And in this case, 16% was in the double vaccinated. So you cannot make the case that this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. This is a pandemic of the vaccinated, and they actually have the greatest numbers. Now, someone will argue, well, yeah, but per capita, you know, since most people are actually vaccinated, well, you should see more people that actually get hospitalized or go into ICU units or die. But the point is that you're not getting any protection from the vaccine when you actually look at the numbers. You're not really compromised. And again, 14% unvaccinated and 9% of the deaths. Okay, so we've now decided, based on this kind of data, that we're going to start vaccinating young children. And I know many of you are parents, and you're wondering, should I be vaccinating? Because we've seen, coming here, we saw a big billboard of, I guess it was a nurse or something, that was saying it's important to vaccinate your children. And it is actually approved to go ahead now and vaccinate 6-month-old babies. Okay, so what's the data to support this kind of stuff? Well, when they looked at 5 to 11-year-olds, this is the Pfizer study. This is what the vaccine that was used here in the study. And in this study, they had 74,000 kids aged 5 to 11 tested. They had about 6,897 sites across the United States, so this is mainly in the US. And they had 2 doses, and they found that actually, after 4.5 months of those doses, in the 5 to 11-year-olds, they had negative efficacy. They were more likely to get COVID if they were vaccinated than if they were unvaccinated. So what happens with these vaccines is when you're first vaccinated, you're actually at increased risk of getting COVID. So the first 2 weeks, they don't, if you get sick, they say you're unvaccinated, and they take that data and they put it with the unvaccinated. So it skews the data on the unvaccinated to look much worse than what it is. So then, if after 4.5 months in these 5 to 11-year-olds, they're actually more likely to get COVID, then you're not getting the longer term protection either. So you're more risk initially and you're more risk afterwards. And the efficacy after 1 month, after the second dose, was 60%, not 95%. But after the second dose, by the time you get to 2 months, it's 29% efficacy. This is no efficacy. Now, the problem is this. This is based on the idea that these children don't have natural immunity. Completely ignored. Okay? So when everyone telling you, like, well, in the studies, we can see the unvaccinated compared to the vaccinated, and they're getting, less COVID cases, which is actually not true. You're actually 3 times more likely with your 3rd shot to get actually COVID than an unvaccinated person. But it's not taking into account that the virus has changed in time. It's a different virus from the original one that came back in December of 2019. Omicron is much more infectious, but it's also much more benign. It's less likely to give you severe COVID. And the population has now got a lot of natural immunity. So how can you give me these numbers? No clinical trial actually can address this. Now, that's egregious as it is. Another study in New York State, they had 365,000 students that they monitored, 5 to 11 years old in this clinical study. they found that during the peak of Omicron infections, the efficacy after 5 weeks was 12%. So it's even worse than the other US study. There is no efficacy for these vaccines in young children. Nothing that's lasting. These are published scientific papers. Okay, well, you think that's bad. So you might think, okay, we're now going to vaccinate babies that are 6 months to 23 months old, or 2-year-olds to 5-year-olds. Well, what is the study on the 2 to 5-year-olds? And I have to explain what's called ARR, this is absolute risk reduction, and relative risk reduction. So let's say you had 2,000 people in one group that were unvaccinated and 2,000 people in another group that were vaccinated. And you look to see how many of them in 6 months got COVID-19, as monitored using the PCR test, which is actually 95% inaccurate. So as it turns out, you might have 160 that are in one group out of the 20,000, that's the unvaccinated group, and you might have 10 cases in the vaccinated group. So you say, well, 10 cases compared to 160 cases, well, that's like a 95% efficacy. This is actually what they got in the Pfizer clinical study to approve this for adults. So that's called relative risk reduction. That in your two groups, those that actually got sick, you were able to reduce the occurrence of the injury, the COVID-19, by 95%. So that's what you're hearing in the newspapers, that these vaccines are 95% efficacious. But the FDA itself warns that you should not present data of relative risk reduction because it actually is suggestive or gives a misleading idea of what your risk reduction is. Remember that out of those 20,000 people, only 160 of them actually got COVID. So when you calculate based on the original 20,000 and how many got COVID in the two groups, the unvaccinated and the vaccinated, the difference is a 0.84% reduction, less than 1% reduction. So again, to put into context, if you're vaccinating everybody in the country, you can expect to reduce, with everything working well, the occurrence of COVID-19 by 1%, less than 1%, in 6 months. And of course, these vaccines only last barely 6 months. So you have to do it again to keep that another 1% from getting COVID. Okay, so in these studies here with the 2 to 5-year-olds, the difference is, first of all, in this study, they actually had about 5,000 children that were in the study, but 3/4 of them never finished it. So only about 1,500 finished it. And when we look at the number of participants here, 2 out of the 481, and this is actually after the 3rd dose, because the first 2 doses, they had negative efficacy. They had to redesign the clinical trial to have a 3rd dose, because the vaccinated group were more likely to get COVID than the unvaccinated group, okay? So the difference then here is at the end, 7 days after the 3rd dose, they give a 4-week period, so a month after that, 7 days after the 3rd dose, 481 participants, 2 of them got COVID-19, 2 out of 481. But, and again, bad trial design, they had twice as many people that were in the vaccinated group than in the unvaccinated group. So they ended up with 5 out of 209 that were vaccinated. So the difference between the two groups was 3 people, 3 children. And this is what you call a bridging study. They don't have to do all the longer term testing, especially for safety. They just have to show that these children had antibodies like they saw in the next age group, which was the 5 to 11-year-olds. So that's all they looked at. Okay, and from that, a difference of 3 children, they thought that demonstrated that these vaccines work in children, and the safety wasn't even an issue. And it was only for a month. We don't know how long it lasts after that. Well, you think that's bad. Here's our babies, okay? And so in this study, bottom line, one of those children got COVID out of 277, and 2 of these children got COVID out of 139. Now that calculates to a 76% efficacy. It was negative efficacy in the first 2 shots, but here's 76% relative risk reduction. There you go. Let's approve it. That's what the FDA did, and then Canada followed suit a few weeks later. A difference of 1 child, a single child. I mean, me as a scientist looking at this, and I'm wondering to myself, what is going on with our public health authorities that are supposed to protect us and demonstrate at least that it's efficacious? Well, I'm even talking about the potential injuries here yet. Okay, so remember I told you that if you get vaccinated, you actually increase your chances of getting COVID-19 in the first couple of days, like first 2 weeks. Here's the data. This is from Alberta Public Health in August of 2021. They posted this data every week until the middle of January and stopped doing it after that. But this is just before they did that, January the 11th, 2022. So what this is showing you is by age, so these are the different colors. The red is under 12, and orange is 12 to 19, and yellow is, again, the age group 20 to 29, till finally you have the dark blue, which is 75 and older. But here's the thing. This is measuring whether or not, if you got COVID and you were vaccinated, when did you get COVID? Was it 3 months later? Was it 6 months later? No, it was actually a week later. This is 1 week after the injection, okay? This is the number of days. So the first 7 days, your risk goes up, stays high for a couple of days, and then it starts to drop as you start producing antibodies that will recognize the virus. So this is all of these people that are in this part here, they would have been included in the unvaccinated group. So this is what I'm referring to earlier. Now later on, as we got Omicron, we actually got large peaks around 90 days and up to 120 days. So that kind of changed the equation, but that's from their first shot of the vaccine. Okay. And you see with your second shot an increased risk, and then it goes down again. Well, you may say, okay, most people are going to get vaccinated and they're not going to experience a clear injury, and that's true. Most people don't. On the other hand, someone like Dr. Charles Hoff did a study in Lytton, and he looked at people that were vaccinated and found that 70% of them had D-dimers. D-dimer is a breakdown product from blood clots. And so these blood clots indicate that there was some sort of, obviously thrombosis going on. These would cause microclots. They would be in your capillaries. Not quite as deadly, but for some, you may in fact get larger clots, but it indicates that you actually have this action going on. Now here, this is data from Scotland, and the Scottish data was really good because they were much more forthcoming than in Canada and certainly in BC on this kind of data. So the important thing to see here is that we have a peak here of elderly people that are vaccinated. Actually, this is the elderly people here. This is the rate of hospitalizations here. And what you see is that right at around, in this case, October, around 11th, they get this big spike of people that are much older that are being hospitalized. That spike is coincidence with vaccination for the third shot for people that are elderly. So later, there is protection here compared to some of the others that are unvaccinated, but that protection doesn't last. So they're at risk initially of getting COVID right after they're vaccinated. They get some antibody protection and then it wanes. Okay, so as I said, it looks like one of the real questions is, well, if you've been vaccinated, if you have natural immunity and then you get vaccinated, is that better? Are you like have even better protection because you're kind of boosting your natural immune response? No, unfortunately not. It actually is worse. Okay, so here's a study that was done by Moderna, that produces one of the RNA vaccines. They looked at 18-year-olds and longer, and what they did was they wanted to see that if you've been pre-vaccinated and now you get infected, do you actually have a good antibody response? And they can't look at the spike protein because you can get antibodies against the spike protein with the vaccine or from the COVID-19 itself. But from the vaccine, you can't make nucleocapsid protein antibodies. Nucleocapsid is one of the proteins that's also in the virus, like the spike protein. And so what they found was that if you previously basically were vaccinated and then you got COVID, you only had about a 40% production of those people with antibodies against the nucleocapsid protein. Whereas if you were not vaccinated and you got COVID, you had a 93% were actually had antibodies against the nucleocapsid protein. So what that means is your immune response, if you've been pre-vaccinated, is reduced compared to if you were not pre-vaccinated. Okay, so you're actually making it harder for your body that if you do get a natural infection, which is going to be broader, because you're going to be producing antibodies against all 28 proteins in the virus, you're going to be making those antibodies in your lungs and airway spaces of what we call a class, an IgA, IgM class antibodies. They're secreted into your lungs and they're very effective at locking on to the virus before it gets into the body or too far into the body. Whereas when you're vaccinated, you have an IgG response, and there's very low levels of the IgG antibodies that are in your lungs and airway spaces. This is why people who are vaccinated can still get infected, they can still get COVID, and they can still transmit basically the virus to another person. So you're reducing your immune response, and they found that even an unvaccinated person with mild COVID had a 71% chance of showing these nucleocapsid antibodies, compared to a 15% chance with a vaccinated person that recovered from mild COVID. So it's not just a severe COVID, it's even mild COVID. We're seeing even a poorer response. Okay, well, do you in fact, again, this is the United Kingdom data, when we look at a period here near the peak of when Omicron was happening, the first wave, just after Christmas in early January and into February. When we look at different age groups, now for the 18-year-olds in that study, there seems to be actually more cases in the unvaccinated group than the vaccinated group. But at all other ages, there's 100 from 18 to 29 to down here 70 to 79 or over. There's actually, especially in this middle age group of the 18 to 69-year-olds, you actually have higher rates of infection with SARS-CoV-2 if you're vaccinated than if you're unvaccinated, double vaccinated. I'll say that again. You're more likely to get COVID if you've been vaccinated than if you've been unvaccinated. Yeah, and again, we can see this adjusted rates, that you have increased rates of actually having its negative efficacy for preventing getting COVID. So people say, well, yes, we all agree now, you're vaccinated, you can still get COVID, you can still transmit it, but you're not going to get as sick. But well, we're talking about a different virus now that is actually much more mild in its effects, and you probably already have some degree of immunity. So how can you tell me that you're actually are being protected by the vaccine? It could just as well be from your natural immunity or the virus. So that brings us then to the next question. Well, okay, it doesn't look like these vaccines are particularly good at preventing you from getting COVID-19, and the efficacy does not last. Whereas I can tell you with natural immunity, the efficacy can last for years, even decades. Okay, we still measure today in our lab people that have antibodies against SARS-CoV-1 from 2003. They still have antibodies that recognize that. In fact, those antibodies are protective against people that get COVID-19. It's one of the reasons why most people don't get sick, because they have natural immunity. The older they are, the more likely they have other antibodies that recognize this coronavirus, and they cross-react. So then the real question is, well, what about safety? Well, I mean, this is the US system, the VAERS system, this Vaccine Adverse Events Reporting System. It's been in existence for 31 years. More than 80 different vaccines have been evaluated. Anyone can file an injury report. Most of the time when you look at this database, it's filed by doctors, in fact, and it's quite well vetted. And if you look at all the other vaccines here, since 1990, 2021, right when we start having the vaccine reports, that includes now the 3 vaccines that are available in the US, they don't have AstraZeneca's vaccine, the UK vaccine. Why? Because they didn't think that it was a very good vaccine. They didn't approve it in the US. They didn't approve it in 12 countries in Europe either, but they did in Canada. And what happened was, there was reports. At first, it was supposed to be 1 in 500,000 cases of thrombosis, but Public Health Ontario determined that actually it was closer to 1 in 55,000. Well, they were very concerned. They stopped giving AstraZeneca in Ontario. Of course, we can still get it here in BC. So 1 in 55,000, remember this, okay? That was enough for them to stop. Now, so this is really all, pretty much from all these 3 vaccines. In fact, if you take all the vaccines put together, the 80 other vaccines put together, sum it all up, you have more injury of case reports, of hospitalizations, and deaths from basically these 3 vaccines than the others put together. Okay? And you can see that when we look at when do these injuries occur, this is days after vaccination. The first day, within that day, the second day, the third day, and goes on. So these have a temporal correlation with the vaccine. And in fact, some of these injuries occur when they get, again, the second shot. So when you get the same injuries the second time around, then the correlation is very tight. So it does look like these injuries are occurring with the vaccination. Now, so this is what I was saying earlier, that more than 55% of all adverse effects and deaths ever reported in that system are with these 3 vaccines. And again, it doesn't include AstraZeneca. So if we look at September 9th, when I last looked at it, we have about 1.4 million adverse reports in the VAERS system. And of those, 177,000 are hospitalizations, with 135,000 that are severe, probably requiring ICU intervention, certainly urgent care, almost 31,000 deaths. Now that's bad, but it's much worse because studies have been done of the reporting of vaccine injury in the VAERS system. And these were studies like the Pilgrim study with Harvard that was done about 10 years earlier, show that only about 2% of actual vaccine injuries get reported in the VAERS system. So experts feel that the actual numbers here should be multiplied by 10 to 41-fold. So even 20 times that difference, halfway in between, we're talking here about hundreds of thousands of deaths. Now, there's been 1 million recorded deaths with COVID in the US. So we're getting into the same ballpark range with the vaccine injury as we're getting from COVID-19 itself. But the big difference is many of the people that are harmed by the vaccine are young people that are low risk of COVID compared to where our major risk is with the elderly population. So you may be able to make a reasonable case that someone who's elderly, especially if they have comorbidities, maybe the vaccine is a good idea, all things being equal, but you cannot make that case for young people, especially children. At low risk, the vaccines don't seem to work. Do they have injuries? Well, if they have injuries in elderly people or middle-aged people, I'm pretty sure they're going to be in children too. So here's a different reporting system. And I did this so that you can get a better sense of what kind of adverse effects. This is the World Health Organization. This has been also operational for over 30 years. And this is called the VIGI Access System. And again, you can go on that website and you can search with these different, for these different vaccines for infectious diseases. And for those of you at the back, this is COVID in the top line here. Next, we have the next most common vaccine used, and with injury reports. So since 1968, we have about 286,000 reports of vaccine injury in that system, okay? But if we look at this system since 2001, we actually have 4 million reports of vaccine injury. So if we just look at the injuries just since 2001, you probably have at least a third of the number of people that are vaccinated have actually been vaccinated against influenza. So you got 27,000 reports of vaccine injury for influenza during the same time period. You have 4 million reports with the COVID-19. So if you compare that to some of like diphtheria here, you know, 51 reports of vaccine injury during that last year, right? So you're about 78,000 times more likely to have an adverse event against the diphtheria vaccine than you do the COVID-19 vaccine, and at least 20 times higher for the, compared to influenza with the COVID-19 vaccines. I think this is telling you these vaccines, there's something about them that they actually do cause injury. Severe injury. So remember I told you we stopped doing AstraZeneca with a 1 in 55,000 risk of basically thrombosis in Ontario. Well, what about these drugs in the past that have been recalled off the market because of injury reports in various systems? This is being data from the VAERS system. So here is the number of COVID-19 vaccine deaths. This is deaths, okay? So when this was done, for the comparison, it's about 28,500 deaths, okay? Here's the recall of Vioxx, 2004. we have 6,663 deaths. And Bellatrix, Baycol, Resolune, Sendanine, diethylstilbestrol, which causes cancer, that's intergenerational, had 213 deaths. It was recalled. Even the polio vaccine that had an incident in 1955, 10 deaths. That's it, they took it off the market. 28,500 deaths. Okay, so we know even from the original trial that was done, the 6-month trial with the Pfizer, they did a 2-month study first, and based on that 2-month study, they then approved the vaccination of elderly people broadly. And then they went to 6 months. We had the 6-month data. They could see in that trial, there was a 300% increase in adverse effects in the vaccinated group compared to the unvaccinated group. 75% of those were severe injury increase relative to the unvaccinated group. And so this was published, and anyone can find it in the supplemental section of the original published paper from Pfizer. However, after the drug is on the market, this is called post-marketing follow-up, Pfizer was obligated to collect all reports of injuries with those vaccines. So what they did was, they had them, they presented them to the FDA seemed okay with it. Now, in that original report, the first 2 months, there was already 1,223 reports of deaths associated with that vaccine, even in the first 2 months of it being on the market. Now, we have this data because they went to the courts to get it. Pfizer wanted this information to initially not to be released for 55 years. And then they argued it should be 75 years. And the court judge said, well, 8 months. You have to release it all. It's basically 350,000 pages of documents. And this was from the first installment where we could start to see this. And so we started seeing risks. In fact, there was an Israeli study who was the first to show a myocarditis risk. So the original reports were that if you were between 12 and 24, your chances of getting myocarditis with your second shot of the Pfizer vaccine was about 1 in 5 to 6,000. Since then, there's been many other studies, and the number varies from about 1 in 2,700 for males, 12 to 24, getting symptomatic myocarditis. Now, myocarditis, as I'll show you, is inflammation of the heart where the immune system is attacking the muscle cells of the heart and killing them. And it's replaced with scar tissue, not new muscle cells. Okay, so this risk, 1 in 5,000, well, that's symptomatic. It seems that asymptomatic myocarditis is about 2 to 3 times more likely than symptomatic myocarditis. Now, while the risk is higher in males, about 8 times higher than females, the risk is in females too. Okay, so these are young children that are very healthy, and young adults that are very healthy. They're at such low risk from COVID-19 itself, but we're putting them at risk of myocarditis. Now, you've heard, I'm sure, maybe that if you have COVID-19, you can get myocarditis, and it's true. But when you actually run the numbers, you're about 20 to 100 times more likely to get myocarditis from the vaccine than from COVID-19. And this seems to be especially so with the RNA vaccines. So this is what I was saying, that we're not counting even for the asymptomatic cases. So I thought that was bad. I thought maybe 1 in 1,200 of symptomatic or asymptomatic myocarditis was bad. And then a paper came out, scientific paper of a study just a month ago from Thailand. And they tested 300 children aged 13 to 18 years of age. 201 of them were male, 100 of them were female. 7 of those 301 children, and they were all males, got myocarditis or pericarditis. That's like myocarditis, but it's the muscle around the heart. So that's a 1 in 29 chance, if you're male, with your second shot of a Pfizer, of getting myocarditis. In this case, most of them were asymptomatic myocarditis, but they knew because they did something that should have been done a long time ago, which is to monitor every child that was vaccinated for whether or not they had changes in their heart, evidenced by magnetic resonance imaging, MRI, or the occurrence of proteins that are only found in the heart in the bloodstream. So this would be troponin. And so if you have troponin, this protein in your blood, it means you have damaged heart. Okay, so that's a 1 in 29 chance. I mean, this is a ticking time bomb. So as I said, myocarditis is when you have the heart muscles where they're being infiltrated with immune cells that are attacking and killing those muscle cells and replaced by scar tissue. So you may say, well, yeah, but we've been hearing that it's mild myocarditis and they've recovered. When we say mild myocarditis, we're talking about the symptoms. We're not talking about the underlying damage that's occurred. That is permanent. It will never be repaired. Anybody who's a cardiologist will explain that to you. And so this inflammatory attack, you have to ask yourself, well, why? Why is it that these immune cells are attacking the heart? Well, it's how the vaccine works. The lipid nanoparticles or the adenovirus is delivering the genetic information to the inside of your own cells so that the protein synthesis factories called ribosomes will translate that genetic information to make the spike protein from it, the actual protein, which will be transported to the surface of your own cells where it'll stick out and remain attached, anchored. And so your immune cells are coming along and they're saying, oh, this is a foreign protein. Now it might recognize that as a foreign protein in part because there are molecules produced from the cell when it has this kind of an infection, including a lipid nanoparticle infection, that signal the immune system to come. But also, if you have pre-existing antibodies, they're going to stick to that spike protein. And having those antibodies there attracts the rest of your innate immune system. These are neutrophils, macrophages, and other cell types that are phagocytic that actually will attack and kill those cells and allow little pieces, exosomes, that contain those spike proteins to then be digested by those immune cells into little pieces and then presented on the surface of those immune cells. And as they travel to the lymph nodes, this is where you have your T cells and your B cells. These are lymphocytes that get educated by your immune system so that when they present that little piece of, let's say, the spike protein in the context of other proteins that are found on that immune cell, it triggers any immune cell, T cell or B cell, that has affinity for that little piece. By serendipity in nature, just so happens that you have a cell there that actually can recognize that. Well, that cell will now be stimulated to grow and divide and lead to a clonal army of identical cells that produce antibodies that recognize that precise little piece. And that's how you educate your immune system. So those cells will become what we call memory cells or plasma cells, depending where they're located. And then when you get reinfected by the virus that has that little fragment, you already have antibodies that will lock onto it. So when you are having the lipid nanoparticles on the surface of your cells, you're sticking up that spike protein, and these antibodies are binding, you're attracting your immune cells to attack your own cells. Now, during that attack process, you're also having your own proteins on your body cells being digested and presented to your lymph nodes where the T and B cells are, and you might actually start making antibodies against your own cells. This is the recipe for autoimmune disease. Things like lupus, myocarditis, that's an immune, almost like an autoimmune response there. Same with Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, colitis, type 1 diabetes, the list goes on of autoimmune diseases. So this is why with your immune system, it's very important that it gets educated and that you're able to take on a threat. But when that threat is not there, those immune cells go quiescent, they hibernate. They don't die, but they kind of rest until you get reinfected again. If all of your immune cells were activated and pumping out, firing their antibodies into your bloodstream, your blood would be so thick, it wouldn't flow. And when you have the large, high levels of antibody, they can cross-react and start sticking to your own body cells, proteins, and initiate these immune responses. So the difficulty is, you want your immune system to be there to protect you when you have an infection, but you don't want it on when you don't. If you do, then you'll start developing autoimmune diseases. So can you imagine? There's going to be an announcement on Monday from one of the federal ministers of funding to UBC to further develop the RNA technology with lipid nanoparticles so we can have all of our other vaccines use the same approach. So every time that you will get vaccinated with that kind of a vaccine, you will just further propagate more chances of an autoimmune reaction. And the more that you vaccinate, the more likely that you'll have this problem. Okay, so this is of great concern, needless to say. So you have all of these athletes that you hear about that are now dropping during practice or on the fields. Here's the actual data that's tracked. So here we have numbered dead in the bottom here. And so it varies by month, partly because it relates to sporting activities as well. But we can see that the increase here, compared to the historical average of deaths annually, is 10 times higher now than it was pre-vaccine, 5 years pre-vaccine. So these are people that are pushing their bodies, and so they're getting basically, this is most likely myocarditis. In fact, there was a study done in Israel where they found that with the emergency drivers, paramedics, they tracked the cases they were going to, and there was a 50% increase in basically, since the vaccinations, of increased heart disease in the patients that they're picking up with usually heart attacks. Okay, so the athletes are particularly prone because they're really pushing their bodies. But the underlying damage is also occurring in young people just the same. It's just that we can see it in the athletes because, again, they're pushing themselves. So you can take a look at all-cause mortality, because, you know, at the end of the day, the whole point of all of these restrictions and the vaccinations is to try to save lives so that the net number of deaths is low. If you look at the data prior to the vaccination, you will actually see with the 5-year average of mortalities that the first year of the COVID, which is when we had the most deaths, actually, there was no increase in all-cause mortality in the country. You know, we had periods of a lot of hospitalizations and periods where we had almost half-empty hospitals, but there was no net increase in the number of deaths. The people that died most likely would have died from other causes. 80% of the people that died had existing comorbidities, on average 4 comorbidities. So we don't see a difference. However, after the vaccine started happening, so we had the COVID deaths initially, but after that, when we have our big vaccinations going on, it turns out that the excess deaths, this is the baseline here, what we're seeing is that there's an overall increase of about 10 to 15%. It oscillates a bit per month, but on average, it's 10 to 15% since the vaccine started. In fact, the major cause of death in Alberta now is adult sudden death syndrome. And the cause of that is unknown. Okay. All right, so I could just finish up briefly on masks. So influenza, the virus is 0.1 microns in size. The SARS-CoV-2 virus is 0.15 microns in size. A micron is a millionth of a meter. Okay, so the masks that people have, the pore size in the masks vary from 20 to 500 microns. Again, 0.15 microns for the size of the virus, and the smallest pores are usually around 20 microns. Okay, so it's kind of like a mosquito and a chain link fence. Now, when you are breathing out the virus and you're really sick, anything that's larger than about 50, 60 microns, a droplet that might contain the virus, it'll fall right to the ground. But if it's smaller than that, it stays in the air like a cloud. Most of those drops up in those clouds that we can see are around 30 to 40 microns in size. So the mask might protect you with the larger water particles, but don't forget, these are very tiny little water droplets. So what happens to water when it's exposed to air? It evaporates. Those aerosols that contain the virus, they just get smaller and smaller. Maybe they're stuck on your mask, but then as it evaporates, the water droplet, it's small enough. And when you got a mask on, you're kind of breathing a little harder, right? So the masks are completely useless. They don't actually prevent any transmission. You know, Anthony Fauci argued this early in the pandemic, in the first wave. So did Bonnie Henry. But at the end of the day, they changed their tune, but it wasn't based on any real strong scientific data. In fact, remember I told you that the size of these viruses, the Canadian Pandemic Influenza Plan for the health sector in 2006 said this about masks, that the use of masks is advised when immunization and antivirals are not available, but is not practical or helpful when pandemics, influenza has entered the community. I mean, influenza virus and SARS-CoV-2 virus are pretty much the same size. They're both breathed in an aerosol form. If it doesn't work for influenza, why do you think it works? And we have decades of experience in influenza. And in fact, these recommendations continued right through to 2015, where when I look at the entire document, Surveillance Annex, the Canadian Pandemic Influenza Preparedness, planning guidance for the health sector, almost in 2016, the word mask is used only once in the entire document, and only that it states that the use of masks still requires evaluation as a protective measure. So this is why Anthony Fauci and Bonnie Henry originally said that the masks were useless, because it was true. And then science got replaced, by political science. and we had nothing for it, and so this is what basically happened. And so there's a number of studies, but they all basically have looked at this. One of the big concerns about the studies to look at masking and their ineffectiveness is, well, what are the repercussions of this in terms of, are there health risks associated by wearing masks all the time? And actually there's serious health risks that are associated with this. I'm just going to quickly go through these masks. I won't give you the details unless you ask, but this is looking at all the various masks and their probability with their pore size and porosity and breathability. Breathability is a big issue with the masks. If you are very active and you're breathing hard, you need more oxygen to feed basically your blood and the cells of your body, like your muscles, that need that extra energy. And if the breathability is poor, then you're what we call it's like sleep apnea, where you're not getting enough oxygen and actually can cause brain damage. So so when we look here, then there are huge harms that come from mask wearing. Obviously, if they're ineffective, but if people think that they're working, sometimes maybe when they should isolate because they are actively sick, but they go out because they got the mask on, they think they're protecting everybody, they have a false sense of security. So this is the reason why we weren't in a pandemic of the unvaccinated. We were in a pandemic of the vaccinated because they were going out and actually spreading the virus because they thought that, they're immune, they can't do it. But can you imagine a child, a baby that's growing up, and the mother is wearing a mask all the time? They're not getting facial recognition. They're not being able to read and understand, with both how the lips move. These neural pathways that are in the brain, they're actually effective only for a certain period of time in the child's development. So if they're growing up constantly around people wearing masks, not seeing smiling faces, only seeing parts of the body, the face, they are actually going to be neurologically damaged from this. And then when you have kids in schools, in elementary schools, and everyone around them is a threat, and they can't see their faces, they can't go near them, the psychological damage that happens. So we've seen, for example, in BC, that once the rate of, let's say, illicit drug overdose, right? We were having 100 people die every day in British Columbia, okay, on average before the pandemic. Every day. You can calculate in the first year the increased numbers of death of that 100 was actually about 2 to 3 from COVID. That includes everybody. The number of deaths that were coming from illicit drug overdose prior was 3.5 deaths. And after the first year of COVID, it was 6 deaths of the 100 were illicit drug overdose. Now, that comes from anxiety, depression, and people look for some sort of recourse, and then they take these drugs, and because there's a high content or chance of fentanyl in it that can overdose, they die. Maybe they want to die. Maybe they're just so depressed. If I was that age and I want to kill myself, I probably would do it with fentanyl. I mean, at least when you're going, it feels good on the way. So I don't know what the explanation is, but we have, even in the second year, even higher amounts of illicit drug overdose than even in the first year. So this is just one example of the severe impacts, the psychological damage that occurs. And of course, people losing their jobs. And now we're in a time, because of these restrictions, where we see inflation, we see that the price of things are going up, except the cost of a house has dropped down, but You're still stuck with these mortgages that have to be paid, and the interest rates are going up, and it's just like bad news all around. And all of this, on top of the COVID-19, the psychological trauma that our society is going through, it's going to get worse in terms of the health impacts. So it's why it's so important to understand the risks from the virus. And you may have heard people say that, well, this virus can mutate and maybe it'll be more deadly. That has not been the trend with this virus. It's not been the trend with any other coronavirus. And the evidence is pointing to it becoming even more and more benign as we have more infections. It's more infectious. But a cold is very infectious. And colds are often caused by coronaviruses. And these are viruses that maybe started off like SARS-CoV-1 or 2, but they're now endemic in our population, and our immune system has grown to recognize it, and we're protected. So the good news is the virus is less of a threat than it's ever been before, and that all of you have immunity to some extent, that you're less likely to actually die from this virus or have severe injury from the virus. But these vaccines, the damage that they are inflicting, and it seems as if they're only going to be more and more utilized. This is actually, I would say, one of the major threats to health in our population globally now, around the world. And so it's important that this information is available so you can make an informed decision. That if you decide you want to still be vaccinated, you at least understand what the pros and the cons are. And these sort of debates should be available to anyone who's contemplating this. And unfortunately, our media is failing, our public health officials are failing, our government is failing, and it's thank God that we have these kind of places that we can come to, and as a society, try to get this information so that at least you're better prepared for what's coming. So I'll leave it there.
So how can people sign up for your clinical trial?
Yeah, I have, actually I should put that back.
I'd really recommend any young person who wants to go into healthcare, sign up for his clinical trial. That will help you.
Yeah, I have a URL here that you can register. Let me just find the slide.
While he's looking for that, there are potatoes available that you can take home for hash browns tomorrow morning. It's good. It's good.
Actually, I will show this slide because I didn't show it earlier, and it illustrates what the test looks like. So we got it down to a 41 marker test. So these are 41 of the most immunogenic parts of the virus that we found after screening 6,000 fragments, which are the fragments that are most likely to be in most people. And the pattern is very different from one person to another. And the top ABC is the spike protein, so we have 21 markers for the spike protein, and we have a bunch here for the other 9 proteins of the virus that are shown in this map. And the nucleocapsid protein here is shown in D1 to 4. And you can see in some of these examples that there are many people that don't produce antibodies against the nucleocapsid protein. But when you go to get tested, and most of the studies have been done in the literature, they use the nucleocapsid protein as the marker for whether or not you have natural immunity. But half the people that we test don't have antibodies against the nucleocapsid protein, even though have had COVID-19. So that's sort of what you'll get back is an image of your own results. And I think let's just find that particular slide. So at the bottom here is a URL, and I'll provide this to you so you can make the link available to anyone, that you register online, and then if you can come to Connexus, we're in South Vancouver, we can actually do the test for you. We do have to charge, because we have no grant funding to do this study, but it's $85 to test against 41 different markers. So for example, if you went to Life Labs, they would test you against the nucleocapsid protein, and they would charge you $75 for the one marker. So we're doing 41 markers, and if you are not convenient, we can send you a blood sampling kit. That kit includes 2 lances, you just need one, and you prick your finger, and then the blood drops that come out, you can spot onto a protein saver card, and you just mail us the card. And we can also determine, we charge you an extra $14 for the blood sampling kit. So it's feasible. It doesn't matter if you've been vaccinated before. We're just as interested in vaccinated people, because we want to see how long and how well are those antibodies actually working in those people. And so that's available. We have 4,000 people, but we're going to continue the study for at least another 6 months.
Next question that was given. If you could compare Sweden with job mandates, lockdowns, economy, their approach, Denmark, Scandinavian countries, compared to Canada.
Right. So, first of all, vaccine mandates. So now in Norway and Denmark and Sweden and actually United Kingdom and Germany, they no longer recommend vaccination of anyone under 12, in some of those countries under 18. And in Denmark, if you're under 50, they don't recommend vaccination anymore. Now, Sweden didn't have the restrictions. They didn't have the masking. They had the vaccines. Things started getting, initially was bad, where they had upfront more deaths. But when you actually look over the course of the entire pandemic, they're not that much different from any of the countries that had their vaccine policies early on, and doing all the restrictions that those countries did. But they maintained their economy, and they've actually were in the best shape of the countries in Europe in terms of overall getting through the pandemic.
Okay, next question. How do we mitigate the toxic effects of the mRNA injections?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think you can. That's why it's so important not to take the vaccine if you can help it. But the good news is the number of people that are going to be severely affected by the RNA vaccines and the adenovirus vaccines, that are going to have effects that they may not recover from, maybe 1 in 500. So the vast majority of the population will be just fine. And actually, everybody's different. The problem is you don't know who you are. These vaccines, some people wonder whether there's even any RNA that's in the vaccines in some cases. In fact, the Canadian COVID Care Alliance, we have a whole big report about the process of how they make and test these vaccines and all the problems along the way associated with that. But it's a good idea just in general to have a healthy lifestyle. Watch your diet, get sleep, get exercise. These all boost your immune system. These RNAs, they're not supposed to be very stable. They normally degrade and they're gone. However, we now know that in some cases, and there's at least 2 reports I'm aware of this, the RNA can be converted to DNA. This can go into the nucleus of your cells. And from that DNA copy, you can start making more RNA copies. And then from each RNA copy, you might make 50 to 100 protein molecules. So spike protein molecules. So what we're seeing is these vaccines spread. They travel throughout the entire body. They go to the liver, the spleen, the adrenal glands. They go to the ovaries. They can pass the blood-brain barrier, they're in the pituitary, and they can be at fairly high concentrations after 2 days, not that much different from the site of actual injection after 2 days. So this means that you could see inflammatory reactions throughout your entire body. And this may account for some of the phenomena I mentioned earlier in our first session. 40% of women, according to 2 separate studies, have menstrual issues after vaccination, either more heavier bleeding or more prolonged bleeding, and also occurs in menopausal women. So the menstrual cycle is controlled by the pituitary gland and by the ovary. So that's telling us there's something going on in all of the, well, a large proportion of the women that it actually affects them systemically this way. And I was mentioning earlier too, in males, there is about a 15% reduction in sperm count numbers after vaccination, that it takes about 3 months or more to get the number back up to what it was before. So that's telling us that the gonads are being targeted with these vaccines. And there has been a reduction in fertility rates during the pandemic, quite a dramatic reduction. Now, there's a number of different explanations for that, but in general, before the pandemic, about 1 in 5 couples has problems having children in our society. They need some kind of an assistance. And the main reason for that is the males. The sperm count numbers and motility and, or mobility of the sperm and the viability, how long it lasts, has been declining by 0.1 to 0.5% per year for the last 30 years. And it's getting to a point now where we're getting a large number of couples that can't have kids. If you couple on top of that now a further 15% reduction with the vaccines, then now we're seeing, we don't know if there's some sort of permanent effects. In the case of the woman with the ovaries, any damage to the ovaries that results in loss of oocytes means that they will go into menopause sooner and they'll be less likely to have children. So there's all kinds of conflicting data on, well, if you're vaccinated and you're pregnant, are you putting your child at risk? Some of the studies have indicated as high as 28 out of 29 in one study actually had stillborns. On the other hand, you have other studies that come out of UBC, for example, where they say they look for vaccine injury in the mothers, and they don't report, in fact, they reported slightly less vaccine injury in the triple vaccinated compared to the double vaccinated, which is kind of interesting. But it's actually, clearly I've shown you that the increased risks associated in general, so why do you think that a pregnant woman would be even more resistant to that vaccine injury than a woman who's not pregnant? So I'll leave that with you.
Next question. How much does each jab cost?
Well, that's a good question. I actually calculated this. It's about $2 to actually produce the vaccine. I believe they're charging somewhere around $20. Now that's because they have an agreement with the mass production. We have a guaranteed market where the government is actually the advertiser, because the drug companies don't have to do this. But once a vaccine is no longer kind of required, then it'll probably go to the price that we see the other vaccines, which is more like $150 a shot. So you can see the markup, even from $2 to $20, when you've got everybody getting vaccinated multiple times per year. This market is bigger than the drug market. Because, in the drug market, you have people that are sick, and you're giving the drug specifically for the people who are sick. Here you have a drug, gene therapy, that, frankly, these vaccines, in terms of their testing, it's about 10% of the normal testing that we would do for a drug. Okay, because of this emergency use authorization or interim order in Canada. But these are genetic therapies. And genetic therapies have even a higher standard, which has been completely ignored with these particular drugs. Now, they've redefined the definition of a vaccine recently, but a vaccine now is anything that boosts your immune system to fight disease. Before, it used to be it boosts your immune system to make your actual immunity. So actually, technically, even yogurt qualifies now as a vaccine. But here's the problem. Since the 1960s, in the United States, with Nixon approved a law that vaccine manufacturers are protected against liability, provided it isn't gross negligence on their part, that the victim cannot sue the producer of the vaccine. This is different from regular drugs. So when you define these genetic therapies as vaccines, they don't have any liability. So this is a wonderful situation. They can produce this product and get away with 10% less testing. And the average cost of a drug is $1 billion to test. It takes about 10 years. 90% failure rate in clinical trials. But they can put them on the market with 10% of the testing, with no liability. And this is what's being pushed by our own government, and our regulatory agencies are approving this. And just to give you an idea of conflict of interest, right now in Canada, over 50% of the costs to test a drug to get approval is borne by the manufacturer. So you may say, well, that's great, but they want to increase that to 90%. In some other countries, it is already 80 to 90% of the cost is paid for by the manufacturer for the testing. So you have a regulatory agency that you have to decide, well, who's really the client here? Is it the general public, or is it the hand that feeds them, that pays for these costs? And when you have that kind of conflict of interest, then this is what you see, right?
Do morticians discover thick blood in deceased vaccinated individuals?
I don't know what to think about that. I can tell you that I've seen the pictures, and it looks to me like arteriosclerotic plaques. And so when during the Vietnam War, American surgery really took off because they had a lot of young soldiers that were injured on the battlefield, and they developed very advanced surgical techniques. And when they examined these troops, some of these were only 18-year-olds, they had arteriosclerosis already. And we're talking the 1960s. Can you imagine what the situation is today, where we have the diet that children typically have of soft drinks and pop and very high-fat diets, lots of carbohydrates? We know that obesity in our schools is around coming up to 20%. In the States, it's even higher. It used to be 4% in the 60s. So in general, people, including older people, there's a lot more arteriosclerosis. Now, when you've seen an arteriosclerotic plaque, when it's been cut to pull away from a vein, it actually is like white, jelly-like, and plastic-like. And if you pull it out nicely, it carries out the exact shape of all the capillaries and all that. So if any of those are being broken, especially when you're embalming somebody and you're clearing out blood from, these are probably arteriosclerotic plaques that we're looking at. I don't think that it's some sort of overall change. There may be, with thrombosis going on, more clotting, but there will be clotting anyways when a person dies. Eventually, it solidifies. And then what happens is later it then liquefies. This is the story of vampires. So what happened to, people would be digging up these bodies because they'd be afraid of vampires, and they want to put a stake through the heart. And so when they dig up the bodies, they'd find that when they put a stake through the chest, first there would be a big sound coming from the mouth of the vampire, which is really the air from the pressure and the gases that were building up inside now being forced through the lungs out the mouth, and so you get a noise, but also the blood is now liquefied that was before solid, and now they're actually bleeding. And so that's why they thought these were actually living, or the living dead. That's where the vampire legends come from.
Okay, false positives in PCR tests. What's the proof?
Well, the gold standard is to be able to take a sample that you believe is infected with the virus and infect cells in culture to see if they die, if they're killed by that virus. And you're diluting out your sample. And this is how we actually get what we call multiplicity of infection. How many molecules, or sorry, how many particles of the virus do you need to actually cause the killing of a cell? And so when you take a sample, we do what's called PCR, polymerase chain reaction. This is where we're amplifying the amount of genetic material with each cycle by doubling it. So imagine that you have something like 2 to the 35th power. That's billions of times of amplification of the original material you had. Now, if we take a sample and we amplify it, this is a cycle threshold number of how many times we actually go through these cycles. If it's more than 27 times, to detect that genetic material, and you culture cells with that, the cells don't die. It's non-infectious virus. The average testing is done at over 35 cycles. So that's where you have a 90% plus inaccuracy. So if you have someone who's recovered from SARS-CoV-2, 2 weeks later, and you do a PCR test on them, they will test positive. They will have remnants of, perhaps, of the virus, pieces left over, like partial broken up pieces, and that will be amplified and give a signal. But this person is not infectious. So with the PCR testing, it's overly sensitive, and so you may have people that are not actually infectious at all, but are testing positive, maybe showing up in hospital, and for another reason, oh, you're PCR positive, you're a COVID case. Right? That's how it was done. The rapid antigen test is actually measuring the amount of the proteins that are in the virus, particularly the nucleocapsid or the spike protein, but it's not very sensitive. So in the first 1 to 3 days of being infected, you will test negative. In fact, the manufacturers of rapid antigen tests tell you that this test is not accurate in the first 3 days. By the time you get to a point where you're sick, then you get a nice result. But you already know you're sick. Yeah.
Where does Bonnie Henry get her information?
Well, for that question, I've written her letters, as has my colleagues at the Canadian COVID Care Alliance. So it's not like she doesn't know with the information, with primary references and everything, just so she's educated. But there'll be other advisors that she has within the Center for Disease Control. The same center that the second major benefactor after the Vancouver Foundation is Pfizer, with other advisors that have major grants from the government to look at COVID, and includes, again, from the vaccine manufacturers, that some of these people are actually advisors that then go and continuing medical education courses, instruct our doctors about what's going on. So I think there's information that comes from the public health, and that information, again, is kind of compromised. So in all fairness, I do believe that most of our officials, they're trying to do what they think is right. And they are getting certain information that's very siloed, it would seem, and they just can't believe that things are as bad as they actually are. But, at some point, it's so obvious. And then what are they going to do? Well, they're going to tell you that, yeah, okay, the vaccine doesn't prevent you from getting COVID and it doesn't prevent transmission, but, you're going to not go to hospital. And then it turns out that, well, actually, you're more likely to go to a hospital if you've been vaccinated going forward in the future. I don't know. I'd be very, very interested to see how the narrative changes. But there's actually doctors that are now publishing scientific papers that were very strong advocates of vaccination that have now come full circle and are calling for a moratorium on vaccination. So it's happening.
Applause. Do you agree with Sucharit Bacardi that the mRNA inoculations are affecting cognition?
I would have to think so, because if these vaccines are actually crossing the blood-brain barrier, and you are in fact getting inflammatory responses where you're attacking nervous tissue now, it's hard to imagine that you wouldn't get this. I mean, the virus itself, there are cases of brain fog associated with this, and so the spike protein itself may be pathogenic. You may have actual destruction of neurons from COVID-19 itself, but the vaccine and these lipid nanoparticles, I mean, let me put it into perspective for you. Imagine that you were getting vaccinated against a typical vaccine, the traditional ones. You may wonder, well, how many virus particles are you actually getting in that vaccine shot? It's probably less than 100. An attenuated virus that doesn't reproduce very fast, but it is produced, and it gives time for your immune system to get to know it, to then be able to take it out. These lipid nanoparticles, when you're getting them injected in you, it's trillions of RNA molecules are going in with each shot. It's a completely different ballgame.
Okay, the D-dimer test, when should one take it?
Well, I think the odds are that if you have just gotten vaccinated, you will test positive with the D-dimer test if the data from Charles Hoff and others that I've talked to have actually told me. I don't know why it is that this isn't standard done. In the Pfizer trials, this is the problem. In all these trials, what they do is they're measuring to see, with usually PCR, whether you have some symptoms of COVID or whether you test positive with the PCR test, which, as we explained, can give you a lot of false positives. What they've not done in any studies that I've seen is to look at D-dimer levels or troponin levels or any of these molecular tests that are easily done that could have been done in the clinical trials. They were never done. And the biodistribution particles with the actual vaccine itself was never done, even in the mice. Like, these bivalent vaccines that you're now getting, it's a combination of the original Wuhan strain, 50% of it's that spike protein, and the other half is a mix of, it's a variant that has mutations you see in both the B5 and the B4 Omicron variant. So, in fact, it's so incredible. I would have, if you're going to do this, I would have had, half the stuff would be lipid nanoparticles with just the Wuhan, and the other half would have been with this other RNA for the most recent version. And then I would have just mixed the nanoparticles and injected it. But no, what these guys are doing is they're taking the lipid nanoparticles and like one lipid nanoparticle, and they're having the RNA from both different strains in the same lipid nanoparticle. So when that lipid nanoparticle goes inside a cell, these spike proteins, there are actually 3 3 separate strands, identical strands of the spike protein that interweave with each other. So we're creating in these people a hybrid version of the spike protein complex that contains a combination that's never been tested before in nature. So we don't know exactly whether this makes a big difference or not. But the original testing of the bivalent vaccine was done not with the version that's injected into people now, which has FDA and Health Canada approval. It's with a version that has the Wuhan and the Omicron B1 version. And that's where they did a clinical trial and saw that actually the original Wuhan version is just as good as the bivalent, which is not surprising because I've explained to people it's 97% identical, right? But here's the rub. The study that was done with the version that's injected into people now has only been tested in 8 mice. 8 mice. Now, as it turns out, I mean, you know, you've all heard that SARS-CoV-2 is from a bat, right? Well, did you know that SARS-CoV-2 does not infect bat cells?
Blows that theory.
It doesn't infect mice either. So when you're doing these tests in mice with these vaccines and you're producing the spike protein, that spike protein can interact with the ACE2 receptor. So you can't actually see in this animal a response to the spike protein because it doesn't bind to ACE2 as it does in humans or many other species. They could have used a guinea pig. The guinea pig, it works. But in the mice and the rats, it doesn't work. But that's what was used to approve 8 mice. So,
Okay, talk to us about animal reservoir.
oh yeah, well this is the thing that's kind of stupid. I mean, the original idea was that if we vaccinated everybody all at the same time, we could stop this virus in its tracks. So we know that the virus, while it doesn't infect bats, it does infect pangolins, and it does infect cats, and it can do minks and ferrets, and it can do dolphins.
How about dogs?
It can infect dogs. It can infect deer. So you got this huge animal reservoir where the virus can propagate, probably do mutations. So even if you wiped it out of people temporarily, it would then come back in after, you know, our vaccines have, you know, waned because they don't have natural lasting immunity.
Okay, so we're going to devil's advocate a bit here. Jackson Dagger gave a response to you on UBC, I guess is a UBC student paper or something, and he called what you're saying misinformation, misleading, deceptive,
Yes.
reflects poorly upon you and UBC as a whole. UBC staff, students, and faculty deserve better from our Senate representatives.
Right. So he called me up one day, and I explained to him, this is about over a year ago, and so I explained to him the concerns that we had, and I gave him primary references.
Yeah, September 25, 2021.
Yeah, and then he was concerned with my calculation, I believe, of...
Is he an expert?
No, he's an undergraduate student. He's in the Faculty of Arts. He's not even trained in science. But I guess he's read newspapers. So this is what's informed him. But yeah, he put that comment out, but I mean,
It's still there.
Oh yeah, well I don't censor. Yeah, so, but this is a kind of reflection that we've had at UBC. Like, for example, you know, the fear and paranoia that exists in UBC Senate, because I'm a senator, as you can tell from that, I was against rapid antigen testing, and I was definitely against vaccination. And fortunately, well, as it turns out, I gave a long document to a lot of my faculty senator colleagues, and it came to a special vote whether or not we wanted to have mandatory vaccination at UBC. And the vote was actually about 28 to 24 in favor of mandatory vaccination of staff, students, and faculty at UBC. But the final decision is made from the Board of Governors. And on the Board of Governors, there's one extra seat with the government representations. And at that point, Bonnie Henry, to her credit, did not think that we should have mandatory vaccination in the post-secondary education. And so it got defeated at the Board of Governors. But when you look at the breakdown of the senators, you know, we have student senators, we have faculty senators, we have deans, and then there's some from also, I think, the employees. So it was the student senators that were the most adamant that we should have vaccination of everybody. And it was the student senators when we had the rapid antigen testing program that, like for example, the president of the alma mater for the student body had advocated before that for mandatory vaccination. The president of the faculty association was, again, lobbying for mandatory vaccination of the staff and the faculty. I sent him a letter, Al Richardson. To my surprise, the letter ended up being in a newspaper. I was just a letter from me to him. I preferred in the past to just go through normal channels to present this. But
Yeah, he here calls it an open letter.
yeah,
But evidently it wasn't an open letter.
when I sent it to him, it wasn't an open letter. No, it was just me to him. Just like I sent a letter to the president of the university and the Board of Governors. But he shared it with other people who then contacted me and said, well, you know, is this what you said? Do you believe this? And I said, yes. And they said, well, can we publish it? And I said, well, sure. I mean, it's the truth. I stand by it. So that's how it happened. But again, with the rapid antigen test with the students, UBC decided to do this, that you had to say whether you're vaccinated or unvaccinated, or you didn't want to say what you were. But you had to register. So if you didn't declare, or if you're unvaccinated, then you had to do the rapid antigen test, and you'd have to do it about 2 times a week. So this would be starting in September, and this program went underway, and then they found that actually, I believe it was something like around, there's 65,000 students at UBC. So 5,000 of them actually didn't register at all. And then they had about, I think it was around 8,000 that they said that they were vaccinated, but they didn't offer any proof. So then when we started getting into in-person classes, basically what they wanted to do was to say, well, if you have not registered or you have not done the rapid antigen testing, then you should be expelled for the term. So deregistered. And so when it came time for the voting, the faculty thought this was rather harsh for someone who doesn't want to be vaccinated, especially since it's not actually required, that's too harsh. But the student senators were the ones that wanted to take what was equivalent to 20% of the student body and boot them out from all courses, even the ones that were online courses. It was incredible. And, but fortunately, sanity prevailed, and basically we said, well, if you're in a face-to-face class and you didn't, then you'd be deregistered from that particular course, but not from all courses for the whole term. So, but the students were the ones that were the most fearful and the most righteous about everybody should be vaccinated.
But their risk is the lowest.
Their risk is the lowest, correct.
Yep.
Highest for the vaccine injury, but
With 87% of BC residents vaxxed, do we have any way of knowing what percentage of those people actually did so by choice, and how many actually felt compelled or lost their job, house, car, etc.?
yeah, I can't answer that question. I don't have the statistics. What I can tell you is that, what is it, 60% have the third shot now? So there's a high degree of vaccine hesitancy for the third shot. And I believe for children, it's less than 3 or 4% are actually vaccinated for young children under 5. So I think parents are waking up and recognizing that the risks to their children are not worth it. But the reality is that if you look at most people that are vaccinated, that even triple vaccinated, the vast majority of them are technically unvaccinated now. So this is one group that's only getting bigger, the unvaccinated. And so it started very small, but it's getting more. Yeah.
With all the proof that these vaccines may be doing more harm than good, how is it possible that Bonnie Henry and her band of health brigands, the CDC, FDA, NIH, et cetera, just blindly ignore the true science and continue recommending these poisons?
I can't speak to that either, because I don't know what's going through the minds of these people. I would like to think that they feel that they're doing what's for the public good, but they really need to look at the science. Yes. And that's not supporting them. And it's not just, me and my band of, COVID Care Alliance scientists. We're talking about countries around the world with their actual health officials that had come to this conclusion.
On September 12, 2022, Public Health Officer Bonnie Henry said that the unvaccinated constitute a health hazard in the community. What do you think of this public declaration?
Yeah, it's clear discrimination not supported by the science. Yeah. And I don't know, it's kind of funny. I suppose maybe it's trying to explain why it is that after having these wonderful vaccines that we seem to have more cases of COVID-19 than before, and we blame that, it's the virus has changed and it's just much more infectious. But I think, like I told you before, I think everybody's already been infected in the first wave, most people. We actually had a published paper in Journal of Clinical Investigation. It was based on a study that we did with the BC Women's and Children's Hospital using a test that they had from another company in the States that measured the spike protein, the nucleocapsid protein. And they had 276 healthy individuals, half of them were healthcare workers, and they found that 90% of those people in May of 2020 had antibodies against the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And the journal couldn't believe it. So they came to us, and we independently measured at least 25% of those samples, and not only showed that they had antibodies against the spike protein and nucleocapsid protein, but against 10 other proteins in those studies. And the journal published the work. The conclusion was that these were pre-existing antibodies made against other coronaviruses that just happened to work really well on SARS-CoV-2. Now, we didn't publish this, but we did work with Dr. Ralph Panaflet at Simon Fraser University, who's a very strong advocate of vaccination, by the way, so I'll tell you where he's coming from. But the serum samples that we tested, we gave to him, and he has what's called lentivirus constructs, where these are viruses that have the spike protein sticking out of them. And if they infect cells in culture, they kill the cells. So it's called a plaque assay. And those serum samples that we took from those people, they killed those cells. And the virus kills the cells, but when we add the blood serum from these people, it blocked the killing. So these were neutralizing antibodies that were in these healthy individuals back in May of 2020. So at that time, some of the authors, because they included people from the BC Centre for Disease Control, they said, oh, this has to be due to coronaviruses, like cold viruses or something. Since then I've done like about 14 times the number of people, and I get the same results. And so it's pretty clear to me that those are antibodies against SARS-CoV-2. But we have the data, and even the CDC had the data.
Do you think that shedding is a real thing, and if so, what can we do about it?
It's a real thing. I'm convinced of that because there's so many people that I've talked to that are unvaccinated that have told me their experiences of being around people where they feel ill, and then they later find that these persons are just vaccinated. And the phenomena has been described a lot of places. So, there's two kind of theories. One is that maybe these people actually have SARS-CoV-2 and they're actually spreading it. Because remember when I told you when you're first vaccinated, you have the increased risk of actually getting COVID and transmitting it, but they may be asymptomatic. So they may be giving COVID, the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The other alternative, which I think is probably more accurate, is that when you have that inflammatory attack against your own cells, including the ones that be in your airway passages, you're breaking up those cells, and there's these, we call them exosomes, and they have spike protein on them. So people may be breathing out actually these exosomes with the spike protein, and other people may be actually reacting like an allergic reaction or something to those exosomes with the spike protein. I think that's the most likely scenario. When we talk about this amongst the Scientific and Medical Advisory Committee, we think this is a viable explanation.
As Biden declares the pandemic over?
Yes, he does.
Do you believe that?
Well, yes, I believe that. I actually do believe the pandemic is over in the sense that this virus is endemic. So it's not, the waves are not going to be as dramatic unless we continue to have a strong vaccination program that reduces the natural immunity that we had in the population, and then you start to create the opportunity for more variants to emerge, and we can see how quickly, basically in November of 2021, it was Delta was the predominant one in BC. And within a month, it was Omicron B1. And then there's been successive waves every couple of months. It's B4, B5. It's quite reasonable that we may have continued variants. So in that sense, it's endemic. It's everywhere. But I don't think it's going to be the health threat. It actually wasn't really a big health threat even in the first year of the pandemic. When you put it all into perspective, it became a bigger problem, and we had much larger peaks when we actually started the vaccination programs.
But people think of Italy, they think of the Spanish.
Yeah, Italy's a very interesting case. You saw all those those vehicles transporting all those bodies.
New York City.
Do you know that was the army that was transporting those bodies because they would not allow the bodies to go to funeral parlors in Italy? It was actually, it was very dramatic, but it was not representative of the typical situation in Italy at the time.
So you're saying it was a play?
No, I'm saying that the media, it's like, you remember that earthquake that they had in San Francisco? A few years back, a couple of decades back, and there was highways that were squished down, and one little section there that actually happened. But they talked about the Marine District and all the flooding and damage. It turned out it was a very small section of San Francisco. But when you look at the media accounts, you thought all of San Francisco was either on fire or flooded. And
You're saying it's
that's
over-reported.
right. So media has a tendency, if it bleeds, it reads, and they're looking really for, sensational. And so there has been, at the same time, they've been very careful to have a good alliance with the Public Health Office. So the censorship of any information that's contrary to the narrative that would discourage someone from getting vaccinated, you don't see this until just recently. You'll see it sort of in the scientific literature happening, but even the scientific journals themselves have a high degree of censorship in them. So these are kind of like sandwich papers. They start off saying, oh, vaccination has been so important, and then that shows you all the reasons why it shouldn't be done, and at the very end they say, oh, and we don't want to discourage people from getting vaccinated. That's a sandwich type. The stuff. It's the stuff in the middle that you got to pay attention.
MIT study says that 6 feet apart indoors isn't enough to stop the spread of COVID-19. It might be as much as 60 feet.
Yeah, so major droplets, as we point out, they drop, within, well, actually, there's no magic number. Even the so-called 2-meter number, they just pulled that out of a hat. There's no scientific paper I've seen that they actually tested. Oh, if you go to 3 meters, you have a reduction in transmission. In fact, even the original clinical trials that were done never evaluated transmission. They never evaluated the severity of the COVID-19. They just told you whether or not you seem to have COVID-19. No study has actually done in any double-blinded clinical trial to look at the transmission of the virus. Yeah.
Okay.
Contrary to, by the way, public health officials widely saying that it prevents transmission originally. There's no data to support that.
Vancouver coastal health officials say that we are taking away personal rights and freedoms for incentives.
Like your job? Sorry, I don't understand.
Okay, so Vancouver coastal health officials, they came out and admitted.
Yeah, you're talking about Patricia Daly. So what happened was it was put to her, what's the story with, preventing unvaccinated people from going into restaurants or movie theaters? And she was very candid. She said, these are zones of low transmission, and actually it doesn't affect transmission, but we want to incentivize unvaccinated people, by taking away their privileges, to get vaccinated. And she was very transparent about that.
In the U.S., 8 out of 10 people who are hospitalized for coronavirus were either overweight or obese.
That's correct. And in fact, many of the staff was obese too. Yeah. When you actually watch the videos that were shown, and you see the people in the beds, and you see the nurses and doctors are attending, that's just the situation in especially the southern U.S.
British Medical Journal said that vegetarians have a 73% lower risk. Plant-based, yes.
I'm a semi-vegetarian myself, but I don't see any particular mechanism by which that would be a difference. Clearly people that have a diet that's lower in meat, they have less heart disease and less cancer. So maybe if you have less pre-existing morbidities, you have a slightly less risk of having severe COVID. That might be a mechanism, but I don't see any particular reason why that would be the case in terms of your chances of getting COVID-19.
How can we so actively look for COVID, but so passively look for reactions?
when you say passively looking for reactions, you're talking about...
We don't monitor afterwards.
Well, frankly, I don't think there's any point. First of all, almost all of you have antibodies anyways. You don't need to come to Connexus and be tested. You can just assume you have it. I mean, really, 3.5 years, or almost 3 years into the pandemic, you've had it more than once. So, and many of you may have been vaccinated, so you have some antibodies, at least from that, if it hasn't destroyed your immunity, the vaccine. So maybe if you want to know whether or not you actually have any immunity after you've been vaccinated, maybe that's not a bad idea. But my thinking is, maybe take the temperature of somebody, and see if they've got an elevated temperature, which is a monitor of whether or not you've got an infection. It doesn't have to be SARS-CoV-2, it could be something else. And so in that event, maybe if they're really concerned, like on a movie set or something where it's really critical, take the temperature. If you do a serological test like ours, and we detect antibodies, you shouldn't need to have that done again for many months. There's no point in doing rapid antigen tests every day, or PCR tests, which are highly inaccurate. I don't see the point of that. The only point of doing those tests is if you're sick and you want to know, is it COVID or is it something else? And so then it makes sense to do that kind of a test. But if you're vaccinated, you cannot assume that you have immunity. Not at all.
Okay, it's 2019 and it's November. Rewind the tape. What would you have done if you were Bonnie Henry?
If I was Bonnie Henry at that point, I mean, you monitor, is this serious? Is it spreading? And then you can see that, in fact, there is evidence that it's spreading because we developed tests for that. The PCR test was the first test. But it took a long time before we really had that going in BC, about 2.5 months. I would have started much earlier. But I would have developed serological testing so I have a better sense of how many people were already infected by this virus. Because if you find in your population that most of your population has already been infected, then what's the point in vaccinating your population? And if you are vaccinating your population, how do you know that the vaccine's actually working? And the fastest way to do that is to then do antibody testing. So I think they made a big mistake at the CDC. Early on, they did some commercial tests that they bought and tested and found that they were really crappy tests, that they weren't very accurate at predicting antibodies in people. And so they just dispensed the whole thing. Whereas they should have actually developed the means that we could better track in our community the extent of the exposure. Because while the rapid antigen test and the PCR test tells you, if done properly, that person's actively infected with the virus, you use a low cycle threshold number like 27 rather than 35, then it would have been a much better test. But that doesn't tell you if the person hasn't been previously infected. And so that's why the serological testing is very important. And I would have done a lot more of that. I would have learned my lessons from influenza and better educate the public with respect to how effective the strategies are. Like even in households from China, early on we knew that if you were in a household with someone who had COVID-19, your chances of having and being sick with COVID-19 was less than 18% in the same household, right? So it is evolving to be more infectious since those original studies, but it's also less severe in its effects. So I just think she should have been more transparent with respect to the data and not lump the unvaccinated people that with people who've been vaccinated up to 3 weeks earlier, for 3 weeks. The first shot is 3 weeks. You get COVID in that 3 weeks, might be in the middle of a pandemic, which is when most of these vaccines were actually given to people, which is the worst time to vaccinate people. In case of the residences, like the extended care homes and hospitals, well, certainly for the elderly people, I would take much more precautions on that vulnerable group. Don't leave them in a nursing home if they've got COVID-19, because you're basically creating a killing zone where the aerosol-borne virus is spreading throughout the facility, especially if they don't have that great ventilation and filters like HEPA filters. I mean, there's a lot of things that could have been done differently. I wouldn't have closed half the hospital beds, basically, in the province, more around April, May, June. I mean, that just made it worse. I mean, all these other people that had needed surgeries and cancer and all that, it just postponed their treatment and just created more deaths and misery later. So it's like, I hate to say it, but I would give them like a D for how they handled this. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, give us some pointers what to do.
As opposed to like, what can you do now?
Yes. What can we do? What positive things can we recommend to the public for health and fighting this?
Right. I think it's the basic advice that you give for everything. You know, proper diet, proper exercise, proper sleep. Do a few things you really enjoy. So you have meditation or some sort of things that you feel positive. Go out there and interact with other people. We're very social creatures, and we need to interact with each other. And that's where life gets really interesting and stimulating. Don't isolate people or cover them up when they go out so that it's a barrier to actually interact with someone. You live your life normally as you would have done before COVID. And maybe even now, be even more friendly to people and try to get that healing, socializing happening. That's my advice.
Wonderful.
Live life normal. Don't forget about this virus.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay, so if you want information, come see me. I'll give you my contact information.
And then I'll forward to you copies of slides.
And hopefully we'll pass it through the ways that you found out to come here tonight. And if you want to be sure for future speakers, sign up in the back. I really appreciate your honesty. I really appreciate your willingness to engage.
Thank you.
I really appreciate your openness. And I really appreciate your strong backbone.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for coming, and I hope it's been a useful evening for you. And I hope that the basic take-home message here is that it's really is over, and it's time to go back to normal, and also to the healing, and to actually justice to those that have really suffered, that have lost their jobs. We can't do anything about the people that have died from the vaccine injuries, nor the people that have died from COVID itself. But there's lessons learned here, and I hope that we don't repeat this mistake again in the future.
Wonderful. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for engaging with those professionals. And because you spent basically a day with us, we hope that you and your wife can enjoy some type of weekend away. And so thank you from the White Rock Seventh-day Adventist Church. Appreciate it very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Come back again, yes. My only regret is that I wasn't ever one of your students, but I feel like I've sat at your feet here and it's been awesome. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Bye, everybody.
Appreciate it. Thank you.